This is going to be interactive, I'm afraid. So we need audience participation. Can everybody hear me? Because I don't like standing by a microphone. I like to wander around so as I can pick on people and ask them questions to make sure they've been listening. So if everyone can hear me, then that's great. Is everybody here kind of like a medical type person? If you're not a medical type person, put your hands up. Oh, now this is good. This is good. And if you are a medical type person, put your hand up. I know you are because I spoke to you. Loosely speaking, Colonel. Right, okay. So I'm just trying to gauge the audience because what I'm going to tell you about is blood transfusion over 100 years. Now, if you look at me, I'm actually not 100 years old, so I wasn't around when it all first started. And blood transfusion started a lot earlier than 100 years ago, but we're just trying to look at, because of the start of the First World War, we're looking at the developments and things. And the great thing about wars, if there ever can be a great thing about war, when it's come to blood transfusion, we've actually progressed because we've needed a lot of blood and blood products. So just a little bit about me. I'm a clinical scientist at University Hospital Aintree here in Liverpool. So hence, obviously, I've the accent. I'm born and bred in Liverpool. And I've been in the Reserve Army, as we're now called. We used to be called the TA, but we've changed our name to the Reserve Army, which is a shame because my initials are TA. So I'm not going to change my initials to Reserve Smith Straney. Hello, just take a seat. It's all right, don't worry. Are you medical people? Are you not? Okay. It's just that there's a little audience participation. You're saying I need to pick on people. So I've been in the Reserve Army for, you won't believe this because I was actually 12 when I joined, 25 years. And I know, I can hear you gasping. If you just do some gasping, 25 years I've been in the TA, yeah. So when I joined, I was what we called a trainee biomedical scientist. Now, I know there's a colleague of mine from many years ago sat over there. I'm going to pick on her now. She's sat over there, who is a biomedical scientist at the Royal Liverpool Hospital. So that's where I started. The Army has been really good for me because not only has it's developed me in my field of haematology and transfusion, because when you look at pathology, you think of like CSI and all things like where you cut dead bodies up. And to be honest, I don't like dead bodies. It really doesn't do anything for me. Things like microbiology, I don't like microbiology because why would anyone want to mess with someone else's poop and wee? It's not a nice thing to do. So when I started training, I thought, haematology is good. It comes in a bottle. We don't get any patients, and it's all nice and easy and runny, and I'll do haematology. So that's why I specialised in haematology. The other thing is the on-call was brilliant at the time, so we made a lot of money. So that could have swayed me as well. So I'm just going to give you a little insight into blood transfusion over 100 years and try and maybe educate people into why things have changed and why we had to change. There are some pictures, and there's some very sad pictures at the end. So have we got any animal lovers in? Oh, come on, there must be an animal lover in it. Look, go on, be honest. Just because you're blokes, you can put your hands up. So I'm not sure if you can see this. This first picture, if anyone's interested, I'm a member of the Royal College of Pathologists. It's a really interesting group of people, if you like people who wear socks and sandals. But apart from that, what they organised recently was this Bug and Bloods event. And you can see just over there on that side, that's me. And they'd made this great big Nissan hut, as it would have been set up in World War I, as a kind of like a treatment facility. But inside that facility, they had all pathology aspects from 100 years right up to modern times. So I went along in my capacity as a pathology type person, but also as an army type person. And it was really, really good. If you go on the Royal College of Pathologists website, you can actually see a lot of these pictures because some of the slides aren't brilliantly focused on there. But if you're really interested, because pathology is a big subject, I can't go through every single thing that's happened in the last 100 years because I would probably bore myself, but I would certainly send you guys to sleep. So I'm just highlighting the interesting things that have really interested me. So that's me in the Bug and Bloods event. One thing I did learn is when an 18-year-old girl comes in with a bloke, don't turn round to that bloke and say, your daughter's very intelligent, and then the daughter turns round and says, that's my boyfriend. Because you kind of think, so I had to try and keep my mouth shut for the majority of the event. So as I say, these are the pictures from the Royal College of Pathologists. And it's quite interesting because there's some old pictures and some old slides, and each of the years they've identified a certain interest. So back in 1914, yep, what was significant about 1914? It's when it all started, wasn't it? When the war started. Blood transfusion was really pretty hit and miss up until then. It was a lot of trial and error, and even in 1914, it still was a lot of trial and error. But the thing about 1914 for us in pathology, it wasn't just that the war started. They also invented something called an anticoagulant. So, one of my non-medical people, put your hands up again. Who wants to play? Come on, you've got your hand up, come on. Now this is just a simple demonstration because you people who are really medical people will understand this. But it's to try and highlight what the importance was. What's your name? Ian. Turn around and say hello to the audience. So Ian's going to be my assistant. Fortunately for me, Ian, what I did on the way here, I went shopping. Well, I didn't. The husband does the shopping. But I went shopping, and look what he bought me. He bought me some strawberry jam, and he bought me some Vimto, my most favourite thing. So, Ian, you hold the cup. This is your participation. Now, I'm not going to use this properly because this is going on my breakfast tomorrow. So if you imagine you've given some blood, yep, and you've just collected it into a jar and you want to transfuse it to a soldier that's bleeding to death on the ground. After 10 minutes, yeah? Do you see the analogy? That's what happens. That's going nowhere, is it? Do you agree? Yeah. Do you want to stick your finger in just to check that that is jam and not blood?
That's your breakfast.
All right, then. I assume you've got clean hands in. So the advent of the anticoagulant, it uses something called citrate. And what citrate does, it takes, it stops the clotting cascades because that's blood that's clotted. So we know when we fall over when we were kids. I assume you've never fallen over, Ian? Oh, no. When you fall over, you get a scab, but on the inside, you get a scab as well, and then you start to pick the scab and it bleeds again. We're not supposed to do that. That's what I tell kids, you don't do that. So the thing about anticoagulant, if we put anticoagulant into that glass, we'll have to imagine that the anticoagulant's in there, and then we add blood. This is blood coming from someone's arm, and then after 20 minutes, half an hour, 28 days, 35 days, I'll take over now. It's still runny like that. So this is just an analogy of why anticoagulant really enhanced blood administration on the front line. It's simple, isn't it? Can't drink that because it's concentrated, but I'll dilute it with water later. So that happened in 1914, but the sad thing is, in 1914, they didn't actually start using anticoagulation. They were still doing direct transfusions. So that would be, you would stand, if you were healthy, next to a guy who was sick and injured, and you would literally have some blood taken from your arm, and that was put into the soldier's arm next to you. Back in 1901, which is before the war, a guy called Karl Landsteiner, I know you'll have heard of him, because he's famous in hematology. He invented or discovered blood groups. So we know we've all got different blood groups. Does anyone know the different types of blood groups? Shout one out. Yeah. So that's A type. That is called, yeah, that's a blood group system. The rhesus is another blood group system. On top of that, there's lots more blood group systems. If there wasn't for all those other blood group systems, our job in blood transfusion would be a lot easier, but obviously it's not. So Karl Landsteiner had identified these blood group systems, but it wasn't really taken up. So the army was still doing these vein-to-vein transfusions. The sad thing is, they didn't know, as we all know, if you give someone the wrong blood, they can die with just a few mils of that blood. So what they used to do is they'd give them a few mils, then they'd stand back. If he didn't die, yeah, we'll carry on. So obviously we've moved on just a little tiny bit from that practice in the NHS. We don't just do things like that anymore. Sometimes it's a bit like that. But if you remember that story of the young, fit, healthy soldier standing there, ready to give the guy on the front line a unit of blood. And what went on over the years, as the war developed, various people got involved, and it was only through the Americans, and I hate, no one's American, are they? No. I hate to say it, but the Americans had already developed a decent blood transfusion service. And when the Americans got involved and won the war for us, they brought along a lot of their knowledge and skills around blood transfusion. So there was a guy called, well, he was Canadian Lawrence Bruce Robertson, and he was instrumental in adopting, I'm just checking out the names because I need to get the names right. He was instrumental in adopting blood transfusion practices, and further along the line, there was a battle in 1917 at Ypres. My military knowledge isn't brilliant when it comes to wars and things. They know about sodium anticoagulant. They know that they can give blood, and they know sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. But they also decided that they could keep blood, but it doesn't stay very long, because if you put it in a bottle just in anticoagulant, the red cells start to die off. So this fella, who was a British surgeon now, called Geoffrey Keynes, he developed a way of actually storing the blood into ice packs. And that blood stored into ice packs meant it could last a little bit longer. Not a great thing to do now, because if your cells freeze and then you defrost them again, that's not very good for you. But it was a start. And also they added something called glucose, because your red cells are little tiny cells that don't have any nucleus in, so they need the glucose to keep them going. And that's basically where we're at now in blood transfusion. We use all the same ingredients to maintain the blood and keep the blood flowing. This was the first, non-direct transfusion. So as I've said, they've gone from arm to arm. And this was done around about 1914. And you can see that thing at the end. It looks like a coffee maker or something like that. And basically what they used to do originally, they realized that blood clotted. They had this idea of anticoagulants. They used to defibrillate it, which is basically collect the blood, take the clot out, and just give them the red cells, which is no good, because you need all the clotting factors if you're bleeding. So that worked, kind of worked, but you see all the people around that casualty. Imagine in the middle of a full-blown war, you haven't got that many staff. You need to be able to treat a casualty quickly and fast without all of those people around. So they developed things further, and this is from around about 1917, and it's a transfusion set, and you would take this out and use it for each patient. The interesting thing is, obviously, the needle is the little metal thing at the bottom. That just gets sharpened and used, and it will go from one vein to another. Now, we obviously don't do anything like that in this day and age. We're not allowed to do. Everything's disposable. They didn't have disposable products or anything like that. It was all glass and things. They probably give it a little bit of a wash with some antiseptic that they had, carbolic soap or something at the time, but that's about as modern as it was. Now, this is a picture of me with a 1920s blood transfusion kit. And again, it's moved on a little bit, and we can use anticoagulant in there. I didn't actually use this kit. I'm demonstrating holding it, by the way. But again, all the tubes are rubber. So again, it's just cleaning it and washing the tubes out. So the risk of infection, and that was the biggest problem with blood transfusion, we're still giving fresh blood, whole blood. We're not separating it into its individual fractions. So you can cause lots of other problems if you keep blood in its whole packet together. So the first blood donor service, in the world, I'll let you just have a little read of that. So in 1921, we had a blood donor service. That is not a fridge of blood with a load of people. That's a load of volunteers that we could go and count on, that we could use should we need them. Remember that, because that's important as well, because we don't do nothing like that now. And again, these are all various things that happened between 1920, 23, 28, and 1930. But the interesting thing on this slide of the events through pathology is the 1930s. This is Carl Landsteiner, and this is the chap we spoke about in 1901, where he developed the ABO blood group system, or he found it. He also found the rhesus blood group system. He didn't actually identify group AB. Someone else identified that. And initially, there was lots of people working on blood groups. So even during the First World War, we knew about blood groups, but we didn't know the consequences of giving the wrong group. But they were called Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. He invented ABO. So we had to kind of get together and come up with one nomenclature just to say If you go anywhere in the world, you're Group A, you're Group B, and they came up with Karl Landsteiner's version. And he worked right up until 72, he was still finding things with blood group systems. So, and he actually won a Nobel Prize in 1930, so it took from 1901 to 1930. So for me, that's a significant event in that period, Karl Landsteiner. Now this is interesting because this looks like in a laboratory you're able just to have a pint in the 1930s and 1935. Now, I've never drunk in the lab, especially alcohol, because it's not allowed. But obviously, during those years, you're allowed to drink alcohol, shall we say. But the significant timeline or events that happened during that era was between like 37 and 1939. The Spanish Civil War had happened, and again, blood transfusion had developed even further because of the Spanish Civil War. And what they'd started doing is maybe separating the red cells from the plasma and just having plasma as a plasma fraction. And the other thing is the first blood banks start to be set up in Ipswich, London and Bristol, and they were predominantly run by the Army Blood Transfusion Service. And even at that time, the symbol of the bat is still there now. And I have to say, one of my very first courses as a reservist was at the Army Blood Supply Depot, where they teach you how to take blood, how to process it and all of the things. And that symbol of the bat comes on your CPD certificate. And as I say, it's still evident now. Because of the way that the transfusion has gone very, very regulated, and to make it a lot more safer, the Army Blood Supply Depot is kind of scaled down. But there is still a presence there for things like when we need blood supply on operations. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the operations that we've done. And I don't mean appendectomies, I mean operations of war. So 1940, the RH blood group system was discovered, and again by Karl Landsteiner, but he also had a little bit of a help from Alexander Wiener. Wiener, that's an American thing, isn't it? Or something, I don't know what it is. And it talks about all the various different blood group systems. But the interesting thing about the RH blood group system, when we know we're A positive or we're A negative, is the RH or rhesus blood group system is probably one of the hardest blood group systems to learn, hence why I've never bothered learning it, and just hope that if I ever have an exam, it never gets asked. But we need to make sure that if we give someone the wrong blood group, A, B, O, or A or B, we can kill them. If we give someone the wrong rhesus group, we won't kill them right away, but we've got the potential to make that individual make antibodies and then subsequently kill them. So that's why we need to make sure that we get the RH group correct as well. So back in 1944, what was happening then? Second World War. And this little chap on the end reminds me of our training major, actually, in later life, without the glasses. He sat at the back. There was a big push for blood donors in the Second World War because they suddenly realised blood actually saves lives. We know that now because we're all educated, but blood can save lives on the front line. Even though they'd started kind of experimenting in the early years, there was a recent, it was an article or something I read where they'd looked at 19 very, very seriously ill guys on the front line back in 1918, transfused them, and 15 of them died. Or 15 of them would have died anyway. So they've actually started saving people that were going to die. So obviously, come the start of the Second World War, Winston Churchill is advocating blood donors. Obviously, you need to have looks like you need to have a walking stick to be a blood donor on that picture. But that was really to get plasma. So we're now up to 1940, and as we say, we invented the RH blood group system in 1940, so it's difficult to read some of these things. And from a hematology blood transfusion point, not much really happened. We've got blood, we know we can store it quite cold, and it lasts up to about 28, 35 days. We can store it into blood groups, but we'd started developing basic cross-matching, which is mixing the donor's cells with the recipient cells. Suddenly realising that you needed to use various you needed to use plasma as opposed to cells, and they're looking for reactions. So as they developed, as the years have gone on, they realised that so that we don't have a chance of killing people, we need to mix donor and recipient's blood together. And this is a picture from 1940. And I think it's an American soldier. And because we'd started collecting blood and blood products, he's actually transfusing plasma into that guy there. And which seems a bit strange because they'd started separating the plasma off. But what they actually did was freeze-dried the plasma. So your plasma contains all your clotting factors, so they can freeze-dry it and just reconstitute it. Now, we've had a process of trying to do that now, and we've got freeze-dried plasma. And again, that's good if you're bleeding out really badly. But we tend just to freeze plasma and defrost it. But things like that do work. But again, the syringe going into the casualty's arm and the tubing is all not disposable and would get washed. So if they don't die, they won't die from a plasma transfusion, but they would probably die from an infection, but judging how many times those things are used. So we come to 1947, 52, 53 and 54. Again, not much in the way of transfusion happened, but this book was written. Now, they are a happy couple. They don't look very happy on that picture, but they are like the gods of transfusion. They wrote a book in 1950, and it's called Blood Groups in Men. And it went on. He was his name was Race. I can't remember what his first name was, and she was his technician, Stringer, or Sanger. She was his technician, but they ended up falling in love. So they must have talked about blood groups. So it's got a little bit of a romantic connotation. And the book went on to sell for many years, and probably even when I started in blood transfusion, you could still get various copies of that book. So that was probably the most significant thing in 50, sorry. So we go to 56, 57. The interesting thing that happened there, and it isn't even on that slide, is I work in haematology. So if you're feeling not very well or anemic, or you go to your GP always does blood tests. Sometimes your GP does blood tests. So your GP will do blood tests, and your blood tests come to the lab, and we'll process the samples on the machine. But back before 1955, we used to have to look at everything under a microscope and count all the cells. Now, back at Aintree Hospital, I look at 1,500 full blood counts a day. So imagine me looking at 1,500 full blood counts on a slide. So the interesting thing that happened then was a man called Wallace Coulter invented the Coulter counter. So whilst it's not transfusion, it's interesting to me because it's saving me a hell of a lot of work. And that's developed haematology as we've gone throughout the decades now. So we're up to analyzers now where we literally put a blood sample on, and it tells you what your white count is, what your hemoglobin is, how many platelets you've got, and the different types of white cells. And that's all stemmed from an invention from Wallace Coulter. So we're up to 1961, and this was just, I found a paper, a newspaper, and that was the average salary in 1961. It's not a lot, is it, for a year? Like £300 a year. Imagine that now. I bet you some people, when they first started work, was probably on a little bit less than that. It was something like, and so many 6 pence. I don't understand what the old money was, but that was the interesting fact I found then, because I didn't think anything transfusion or haematology was interesting. I thought the salary was pretty ropey back then. So then we come to the 60s, and everybody had long hair, hippies. But during the 60s, there was plastic polythene bags invented. But we were still on the old bottles. So if you look on this side, that was the old transfusion bottles, and that's what they were using right up until the 70s. And the interesting thing that I found out many years after I'd started in blood transfusion was that my dad's first job was delivering these bottles to different hospitals. And that's how we used to transfuse patients. The blood would go in there, that would stay sterile. But then we moved across round about the 80s into the plastic polythene bags, or the Fenwil bags. The UK were a little bit slow on moving across. They could have moved across a lot earlier. And I think for any older people amongst us that have ever done any transfusions, we used to use colour coding on all of the bags. And blue would be for O. A was yellow. A was yellow. And red was B. Yeah. Yeah, A, B. Yeah, your rhesus type. Yeah. You are showing your age. So, but the interesting thing is, that was to try and make things safer within blood transfusion, because we know what our patient's blood group is. We've gone to the fridge, we've taken blood out, and it's all colour-coded. We know he needs to have a blue bag. But something happened called the Falklands War. Yeah, so we're moving on with various wars. And throughout different parts, we were getting blood supplied in from various places. Different colours were used for different countries, so there was lots of mix-ups going on. So what they decided, the blood transfusion service across various countries, was, let's stop all the colour coding and let's just go to white. Once we've accepted white for a bit, which is the bag on your right, once we've accepted white for a bit, we'll go for a general colour coding system that we all use, but we're still on white and black. We've never changed our colour system. So I'm going to show you now some blood products, because I've stolen them from work. Really stolen them from work. So out of a single unit of blood, if you were to go and be a blood donor, for those of you guys that don't know, if you were to go and be a blood donor, we'd be able to take off you some red cells. These are all expired, so I'm allowed to handle them and keep them out. But some red cells, you can do a little, go on, since you've been my assistant, you can feel that's not clotted, is it? Yeah. We can also take off you something called the plasma, yeah? And that's the stuff that's got your clotting products in. We can also take off you something called platelets. So effectively, we've taken one whole unit of blood off you guys, and we can separate it into these 3 different components. So why would we want to separate it? And it's basically because they're all maintained better at different temperatures. That's better at around about 4 degrees, that's better frozen, and that's better around about 21 degrees. And because there's platelets in there, they have to be kept moving all the time. And they maintain the shelf life a lot longer. So if we just take a bag of whole blood, we haven't got a good window of keeping the blood for very long. And that's what they used to do. Remember we said about your friend on the front line is going to be your donor to the sick and injured guy. Fresh whole blood, so they'd get the whole lot in one go. But because of the issues around that, and also we have white cells, and white cells can cause reactions, so we take all the white cells off. So again, we go to the late 70s and 80s, and it was round about 1980s, because we were using fresh whole blood in the plastic bags, I can remember, especially when I worked at Liverpool Heart and Chest. They used to like bags of fresh whole blood in the olden days, but we stopped using that, and we couldn't get fresh whole blood. We just got the component parts, and that was probably something that happened in the 80s. And this is just a picture you can see in the background. He's hanging up all the bags of the fresh whole blood that someone's just donated. And as your blood starts to settle, the different fractions can be taken off. So 1984, 85, 88 and 91, what was the interesting thing that happened there in pathology? I'll tell you. Yay, I joined the reservist. So I joined the reservist in 1989. Now I have to say that is not a good picture of me. I do look a lot thinner, but that is in Afghanistan. Now it doesn't look like Afghanistan. It looks like any old hospital anywhere in the world, but that's in Afghanistan. I've got a very serious haircut because the little Afghan barber just knows one style fits all. So that's me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you can see in my hand I've got a bag of blood. And I'm looking happy. And you can see everyone around me trying to help me. Not. I was on my own at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that is because the army, yeah, let's go back onto this. The army have gone back to kind of the old way. They've realised that guys getting injured on the front line, they do a lot better if you can give them 2 units of fresh whole blood. And we've developed these massive transfusion protocols now where we've got lots of red cells ready for them, we've got lots of plasma ready for them, and we've got lots of platelets ready for them. Still, if you've got a guy that's lost 2 of his legs, maybe one of his arms been taken off, because usually when they're out on patrol, if they stand on a landmine, they lose some of their arm as well. So you've got our guys coming in who are injured with 3 limbs missing. Now, I work at Aintree. Aintree's a trauma centre, and our trauma bleep goes off a hell of a lot, and it's usually someone's fallen off a ladder. And I'm like, that's not trauma. That's trauma. So it's hard for when you come back from your tours to try and get into that mindset of, you know, he's still, as long as he's still got his 4 limbs, he's all right, apart from the head injuries, because obviously we've got Walter Neuro with us at Aintree as well. So say the Army were probably the first to develop these things, and they're called shock packs. Now, I don't know if anyone works in the NHS and use shock packs, but it's basically, we have the blood ready. So if we know in the military, we've got a casualty coming in, we get a phone call, he's lost both his legs, we already have the blood ready. They've got blood and they've got plasma ready for them and platelets. And in the meantime, we've got this little machine, and that's called a Rotem machine. And what that does, it directs us as to what blood and blood products we use. And how does it do that? We actually look at the patient's clotting system, and it looks at the global patient's clotting system. So if the clotting's gone off a little bit, we'll give them more fresh frozen plasma because they need more clotting products going into the system. So the Army have actually taken that model from 1917 where they've got a donor standing next to the patient, and we're still using it out in Afghanistan, and we're using it very effectively. But how do we get away with it? Because you think of all of the diseases that we might contaminate someone with, they've got white cell antibodies in there. We get away with it because we still comply with MHRA guidance. Everything is guided by rules and regulations. Even out in Afghanistan, we have to comply with the regulations. So that means that every single blood product that we take from a soldier to give to an injured soldier, it's tested for HIV, it's tested for syphilis, it's tested for hepatitis C. These guys have already been tested prior to going on tour, and I've got a whole list of them that we can use if a soldier gets injured, and I know what blood groups they are. So I can just go to my list and say, right, I need 2 units of O-pos, you, and take the blood off them. And that was back to that picture of me at 3 o'clock in the morning, because it's always 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning when they decide to initiate the emergency donor panel. And it's only now within the NHS, within these trauma centres, that they're developing these these massive hemorrhage policies where we're giving 1-to-1-to-1, which is 1 red cells, 1 FFP and 1 platelet. So 2010, 12, 13, 14, again, not much really happened in transfusion, but what was the significant event for me in that year? A trauma case happened. I was in Afghanistan in 2011 and 2012, and this is a trauma case. And what you see with the casualty, what can you make out from the casualty lying on the bed? Shh. That little hand there is a little paw, isn't it? So this is where, if there are dog lovers, look away now. That is a paw of a dog. In Afghanistan, we have sniffer dogs that go out and sniff for the landmines to help protect the guys and to clear the area so the guys are safe. These dogs are treated as well as our soldiers. Now, in my experience, watching guys in current theatre of operations getting treated, I couldn't ask for anything more. If I could go back to any of the parents and say, these guys tried and they tried and they tried, and they do save a hell of a lot of lives out in Afghanistan, that probably if these guys had the same injuries in the UK, they probably wouldn't do as well. And again, it works the same for animals. This is a sniffer dog who'd gone out on a exercise with his handler, and the dog had been blown up. They found the dog and they brought the dog in, and the dog gets treated. We have a trauma team already, to treat casualties. The trauma team just knew that there was a casualty coming in, and that's what appeared. And it's a bit peculiar because you kind of think, oh, you know, if I'm going to put a mask on it, hang on, it's a dog, it's got a snout. I have never seen so many people wanting to help with a casualty as when this dog come in. And I have never seen so many tears because we thought we were going to lose the dog. It was just the most traumatic experience ever, and it was the end of our tour. So the so what of that to me is, look at that. The dog was bleeding to death. I had to get a little mate for the dog, take some blood off the dog and give it to the sick dog. And you can see there's a little Labrador, and we're bleeding him, and we're collecting some whole blood, the same way that we would do for an injured soldier on the ground. I have to say, my understanding of vet haematology and transfusion, you could probably write on a postage stamp. And I'm thinking, how much blood can I take from this dog before it collapses? Because I know how much I can take from a big burly soldier. Fortunately, one of my friends is an animal lover, and I said there was dogs out there, so I always had a pocket of Smackos with me in Camp Bastion, which who wouldn't have a packet of Smackos with them? And as we're taking blood from this dog, it started to droop down a bit. I thought, that's probably enough now. We probably need to stop. So then, obviously, we stopped taking the blood. But if you go back to that picture of me with the big bag of human blood on my own, again, look how many people wanted to help me with the dog. And the dog was almost collapsed because he was dehydrated, and he had a big bowl of water next to him, and I gave him all the Smackos. This little dog as well went out to Afghanistan and failed a lot of the sniffing tests, so he was no good, but he was a universal dog blood group, which I've subsequently learned that there's universal dog blood groups. So what happened to our poorly sick dog? Now, I've covered its eyes up to maintain its anonymity, but this is the dog, this is the said dog. Actually, I was just taking the mickey, you don't have to cover its eyes up, that's the dog. That's the dog now, and that dog's called Fire. She was rescued, and every morning in Camp Bastion, we'd have what we would call a board round, where we'd sit round the table and go through all the injured casualties, and we'd go through all the names, and there was lots of concerns, and then they'd say, the commanding officer would say, now the latest update on Fire the dog, and everyone would wait with bated breath as to what had happened to Fire the dog. Fire the dog got a casualty evacuated in the same way that the soldiers do, brought back home, and the vet who dealt with the dog when it came back home actually took it on and is looking after it. So it was a little sad story. She was available to go and pick up a medal, because we hear about all our soldiers getting medals and things for all the work that they do. But this dog went and picked up a medal for another dog that was sadly killed in the line of fire. And she went and picked up the Dickin medal. So that's quite a good story, because all we see is soldiers losing limbs and things, and we hear of the horrors of Afghanistan, and we hear of the horrors of wars going back, back to the First World War. But that's kind of like, it's a nice little story, because I don't like horrible stories. So what's the future going to bring us? We've heard a lot about blood substitutes and things, and someone was talking about, Ron, you mentioned it before, didn't you, about blood substitutes. Now, they were kind of like, if we can just find things in a bottle and be able to move oxygen to our tissues and take the carbon dioxide away and do the job that the hemoglobin does in the blood, then we'd be okay. But the problem is, the kidneys don't really tolerate anything that we've used so far. There are things and products that they use in veterinary medicine, and there are products that they use in South Africa, but we haven't got any licenses for those things at the moment. Because transfusion has become incredibly safe because of the rigorous tests and the rigorous questionnaires that go on before we take donors, they've subsequently moved a lot of the funding towards research into blood transfusion and taking fresh whole blood and making that as safe as possible. This is a picture, and this is of one of my colleagues in Camp Bastion, and what he's showing, we used to transfuse 1 unit into a patient of red cells, and then we'd give them plasma. We've actually got this system, and it's called a Belmont now, where you can load it up. So if you get a casualty in, all of those individual products are loaded up into the Belmont. It's a rapid infuser, connected to the patient, and all the anaesthetists seem to do is do the Sudoku and just press the button, because all they're doing is, I'm sure there's more to it. I'm sure they have a beep machine that makes a few noises. I'm not sure what that does, but they just seem to press the button. So that takes away a lot of the stress of checking the labels, checking the blood groups, because all of that can be done before the casualty even arrives. And this little thing on the end, I just think that's really cute for, we've got older hay at the moment. If we can try and get kids not as frightened of blood and blood products, I just think that would be a really good tool to use. I think that's my last slide, right? Nothing else? Thanks for listening. Thank you.